Normandy, France, June 8, 1944. The fog was still thick over the hedgerows near Villers-Bocage, damp, heavy and grey, the kind that swallowed sound before it reached your ears. Through that blur of mist and diesel smoke, Michael Whitman's crew caught their first glimpse of movement. Shapes in the fog, round turrets, long barrels, slow, crawling silhouettes pushing through the French countryside. For months, they'd been told the same story, that the American Sherman was a joke, a tank made for numbers, not for war. The magazines had called it the Tommy Cooker, a machine that would burst into flames after one hit. Every briefing, every radio broadcast said the same thing. Germany built legends, America built toys. But that morning, the joke felt less certain. The ground trembled softly. The sound was not thunder, it was rhythm. The clanking, synchronized heartbeat of a mechanized army. Whitman adjusted his binoculars. More Shermans appeared through the mist. Dozens, moving with a kind of quiet determination, not fast, not menacing, just endless. He muttered under his breath that there were too many. The loader beside him didn't answer. He was counting, not tanks, but odds. In the distance, American infantry followed behind the armored column, cautious, disciplined, confident. Whitman had spent years believing he was part of an elite few who could stop the Allied tide. But even he felt the unease. The Tiger he commanded was powerful. 57 tons of steel, an 80-millimeter gun, armor that could shrug off most hits. Yet even the strongest armor could not stop what he was beginning to sense. The weight of numbers, the inevitability of momentum. By noon, the fog began to lift, revealing the green and brown hulls of M4 Shermans stretched across the valley. They looked ordinary, unimpressive. But they moved as one, steady, coordinated, and disciplined. Each tank had a radio, something most German tanks still lacked. Each unit moved with purpose, part of a larger system. It wasn't just tanks they were facing. It was an entire industrial machine. Inside his Tiger, Whitman said quietly that the Americans didn't build tanks to impress anyone. They built them to win. And outside, the Shermans rolled forward like a tide. Not elegant, not graceful, but relentless. The myth of German invincibility was beginning to dissolve, not with an explosion, but with the steady hum of engines that never stopped. If you think this war was won by firepower alone, keep listening. What came next would shatter the illusion of superiority and change what German soldiers truly thought about the Sherman. Before Normandy, before the fog, before the roar of American engines across the French fields, there had been certainty. In 1943, deep in the forests of East Prussia, young recruits gathered around a Tiger I standing like a monument. Instructors spoke of it with religious awe. 57 tons, 88-millimeter gun, armor so thick it laughed at British shells. The men nodded, eyes wide. They were told it was invincible, and they believed it. The Americans. They were described as amateurs, clumsy soldiers driving tanks that rattled and burned. A training officer had once said, "One Tiger is worth 10 Shermans." The recruits cheered. The phrase became a kind of prayer. What no one said aloud was the truth that hid behind the numbers. By 1944, Germany had built just over 1,300 Tiger tanks. The United States in the same period had built more than 49,000 Shermans. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, 37 Shermans left an American one. And the Americans could replace them faster than the Germans could bury their dead. Still, the illusion held. Propaganda reels in Berlin theaters showed heroic German crews destroying waves of enemy armor. Newsreels boasted of mechanical perfection, gears polished by hand, steel tested for purity. In contrast, they mocked Allied tanks as mass-produced junk. In a world drunk on engineering pride, quantity seemed vulgar. But the front had its own education. By late 1943, reports from the Eastern Front began whispering a different truth. Soviet T-34s, though crude, were fast and reliable. And the Americans were learning fast, replacing early Shermans with newer models that carried 76mm guns, improved armor, better optics. German officers started to notice that their weak enemies were evolving, while Germany's own production slowed under bombing raids and shortages. Otto Carius, one of the most respected Tiger commanders, would later write in his memoirs that the Sherman wasn't to be underestimated. He called it a good tank, not dangerous because of its armor, but because it was always there. He had seen them repaired and back in action within a day, sometimes within hours. Meanwhile, damaged German tanks were abandoned, cannibalized for parts, or left burning in the mud. In 1944, German mechanics joked bitterly that their tanks were masterpieces, too perfect to survive the war they were built for. Every component needed precision, every repair demanded time and tools they no longer had. Meanwhile, the Americans replaced engines in open fields, patched armor with scrap, and rolled on. The myth of superiority, so carefully built, began to crack. Not from defeat in battle, but from realization. The Germans were fighting not just soldiers, but a system, an economy that made war simple, repeatable, and unstoppable. Some tankers still refused to believe it. They said luck favored the Americans, that the Allies had no skill, only numbers. But others, quieter men, knew better. They saw the truth behind the steel mirage. The Sherman was not designed to impress. It was designed to endure. If you've ever thought that perfection wins wars, wait until you hear what happened when the myth met reality in battle. The next encounter would change how German crews saw the Sherman forever. Villers-Bocage, Normandy, June 13, 1944. The village was quiet that morning, too quiet, the kind of stillness that made veterans nervous. Somewhere behind the ridge, British armor was regrouping and American Shermans were being pushed forward to reinforce the flank. Michael Wittmann's Tiger sat camouflaged beside a hedgerow. Mud clung to its tracks. The engine idled low, rumbling like an animal barely leashed. Inside, the crew waited, the loader's fingers tapping on the shell casing, the gunner adjusting his scope by instinct. Then came the sound, faint, distant but unmistakable, the clatter of tracks, the rhythmic growl of multiple engines. Through his optics, Wittmann spotted them, a column of Shermans moving along the narrow road into the village. 11, no, more, maybe 15. Their hulls gleamed faintly in the weak morning light, their commanders standing half-exposed from the turrets, scanning the fields. They were confident, perhaps too confident. For a moment Wittmann just watched. He had seen Shermans before, but not like this. Not so many, moving with such coordination. They were talking to each other over the radio, something most German tanks still didn't have. The column moved as one body. That realization bothered him. He gave the order. The Tiger roared forward, tearing through the brush, the 80mm guns swinging toward the lead Sherman. The first shot cracked through the silence, a single, thunderous sound that shook the air. Through the smoke, he saw it. The front Sherman halted, flames licking its hull. The others scrambled for cover, reversing, turning their turrets, shouting to each other. But they didn't run. They regrouped. Within seconds, the other Shermans began firing back, not blindly, but in coordination. Their rounds pinged off the Tiger's armor, harmless but relentless. Each impact was a reminder that while the Tiger could take hits, it couldn't be everywhere at once. Wittmann's gunner reloaded. Another shot, another kill. Yet more Shermans appeared at the far end of the street, reinforcements. The Tiger was a beast, but it was one beast, and the Americans had an entire herd. Inside the Tiger, the loader muttered that this was madness. Too many targets, not enough time. Wittmann told him to focus. They fired again and again. The smell of cordite and sweat filled the turret, but even as the smoke cleared, the Shermans kept coming. Each destroyed tank seemed instantly replaced by another. Every road, every corner, another olive-drab hull appeared. It was like fighting the sea. You could strike a wave, but the tide didn't care. Hours later, when the battle finally quieted, the village lay broken. The Tiger had survived, but Whitman's crew sat in silence. They had won the fight, yes, but they'd seen something far more unsettling than defeat. They had seen an enemy that didn't stop coming back. Whitman would later write that the Americans fought with mechanical persistence. "They lost tanks faster than we could count," he said, but by the next morning they had more. He called it the cruel logic of an endless supply. In that moment, a subtle fear began to grow among German tank crews, not of the Sherman's gun or armor, but of its presence. No matter how many they destroyed, the same silhouette would always return, crawling out of the horizon like a ghost that refused to die. If you think the fear of the Sherman came from its firepower, you're wrong. It came from something much deeper, the realization that no matter how perfect you were, the other side could always outlast you. Night had fallen over the fields west of Villers-Bocage. The air still carried the metallic scent of burned oil and wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, engines rumbled faintly, not from enemy tanks, but from wrecks being dragged away. Whitman's crew sat around a small lantern near the edge of a barn. The Tiger rested a few meters away, a black silhouette against the faint orange glow of the horizon. They spoke quietly, voices low and tired, as if the night itself might be listening. One of the younger men said the Shermans were weak, that the day's victory proved it. "No tank could stand against a Tiger," he said. "No armor could resist the 88. He said it again, like a mantra, like something he needed to believe. The loader just looked at him. He'd spent the day feeding shell after shell into that gun, and he knew what he'd seen. They'd destroyed 8 Shermans before noon. By sunset, the same road had been filled with more. Another voice joined in, an older crewman, grey dust clinging to his uniform. He said it wasn't the Shermans that frightened him. It was the way they kept coming. He said, "They don't seem to care if one burns. There's always another one behind it." Someone laughed softly, though it wasn't a happy laugh. They all knew he was right. Carius had once written something similar in a letter home. He said the Americans fought with patience. They didn't try to outgun you, they tried to outlast you. They'd swarm, adapt, regroup and return before you even had time to clean your gun barrel. He respected that, even if he hated admitting it. As the night deepened, the lantern flickered and their words slowed. They talked about rations, fuel, home, but the conversation kept circling back to the same thought, the Shermans, the endless, humming green tide. They remembered what the propaganda had said, that the enemy built cheap machines, rushed and fragile. Yet those fragile machines had crossed oceans, climbed cliffs, and were now sitting a few hundred meters away. Not perfect, but unstoppable. And maybe the men began to think that was the point. In the darkness, one of them whispered, "Maybe we built ours too well, too heavy, too proud." No one answered. They just listened to the wind move through the broken trees. Later, as they prepared to sleep, the radio crackled. Orders to move again at dawn. One more fight, one more push, one more test of machines and men. They would climb back into their Tiger, believing, as always, that it was still the best in the world. But now there was a seed of doubt buried somewhere inside that faith. The quiet awareness that perfection in war might be a luxury too heavy to carry. The fire burned low. Beyond the hedgerow, across the darkened valley, the Shermans were still moving. Engines humming softly, lights off, tracks grinding through the night. They didn't roar or boast, they just kept going. If you've ever wondered what truly breaks a soldier, it isn't fear. It's realizing the enemy you mocked refuses to quit. Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 1944. The forest was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as Normandy. This one had weight. Snow blanketed the trees, muffling every sound except the brittle crunch of boots and the slow cough of dying engines. What had once been confidence was now exhaustion wrapped in frost. German tank crews huddled near their frozen machines, burning scraps of paper and gasoline-soaked rags to keep warm. The tigers and panthers loomed around them like monuments to another time, beautiful, motionless, and useless without fuel. They had launched one last offensive, a desperate strike through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied line and seize Antwerp. At first, it worked. The fog, the terrain, the element of surprise, all on their side. But then the weather cleared and the skies filled with Allied aircraft. The roads turned to traps and the columns stalled. What began as an attack soon became a slow, cold surrender to inevitability. Inside one camp, a tiger sat half buried in snow, its barrel aimed at nothing. The crew had been there for days, waiting for fuel that never came. They listened to the distant hum of American Shermans moving through the forest, those sounds used to provoke anger. Now they sounded like fate. One of the men said that the Americans must have endless supplies. He was almost right. For every German division running on fumes, the US Army rolled forward with convoys of fuel trucks, engineers, spare parts, and food. The invisible army behind the front. A report from the 116th Panzer Division noted bitterly that half their tanks were abandoned, not destroyed, not defeated by enemy fire, but by emptiness. No fuel, no ammunition, no replacements. The enemy didn't need to break them. They just needed to keep moving. At night, the soldiers talked quietly. They said the Shermans were everywhere. Not powerful, but unstoppable. They envied how the Americans repaired their tanks in hours, not days. They envied the warmth, the coffee, the music from the radios that still worked. And beneath that envy, something else had taken root. Respect. One officer, writing in his journal during the Ardennes offensive, confessed that the American Sherman is not a machine. It's an idea. It shows what happens when a nation decides that good enough multiplied by 1,000 is better than perfection, standing still. That line would never make it into propaganda, but it would survive in letters, in diaries, in the quiet spaces between orders. By January, the German counteroffensive had collapsed. The Tigers were abandoned where they froze. Crews burned their own tanks to prevent capture, watching black smoke rise into a white sky. The sound of Shermans echoed through the valleys again, slower now, deliberate, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The men who had once laughed at that sound now fell silent when they heard it. Because now they understood it. In the snow, surrounded by stillness, one German tanker wrote in his notebook, "We built wonders. They built persistence." Maybe that is the difference between victory and tragedy. If you think wars are lost when the fighting stops, you're wrong. They're lost when one side runs out of movement and the other never does. April 1945. Somewhere on the outskirts of Berlin. The world had gone grey. The sky, the buildings, even the men, all the same color now. Smoke hung in the air like a memory that refused to fade. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years had aged in a matter of weeks. Along a ruined road, a single tiger sat silent, its barrel lowered, its crew gone. Around it, columns of American Shermans moved cautiously through the rubble. Paint scratched, armor dented, some with scorched marks along the side. They looked battered, tired, but they were still moving. A German tanker watched from a ditch, his uniform torn, his boots caked with ash. He had fought in France, in the Ardennes, and now at the gates of his own capital. He'd seen friends vanish, tanks burn, maps rewritten. He had once believed his tiger was invincible, that one German machine was worth 10 of theirs. Now 10 Shermans rolled past him, and not one looked back. He studied them carefully. They weren't elegant, not like his tiger had been. The lines were crude, the welds visible, the metal scratched and pitted, but they worked. Every single one of them worked. He thought of all the times they'd laughed at those green tanks, the jokes about Tommy cookers and rolling coffins, and he realized how wrong they'd been. The Shermans didn't win by being perfect. They won by being enough. Enough to fight, enough to move, enough to come back again and again. Somewhere nearby he could hear the Americans talking, their voices calm, almost casual. They were already thinking about home, about letters, about coffee and music and peace. He envied them, not because they'd won, but because they could finally stop fighting. He looked at his empty hands and whispered to no one in particular that the war had never been between machines. It had been between ideas. One side built symbols of greatness, the other built tools that worked. As the last Sherman disappeared around the corner, the silence that followed felt final. The war, for him, was over. Not with a bang, not even with surrender, but with understanding. Years later, Otto Carius would write that he respected the Sherman for what it was: reliable, practical, and frighteningly consistent. He admitted that the Tiger, for all its power, had been a weapon of arrogance. It looked invincible on paper, but it was never designed for a war that demanded endurance. In his memoir, he wrote, "The Americans understood something we didn't. They built for the long road, not for the parade." In the end, that was the truth hidden beneath the smoke and ruins. The Sherman wasn't a hero or a legend, it was a worker. A machine that carried a generation through mud, across oceans, into history. And the men who once mocked it, in their final days, learned to respect it, not for its strength, but for its persistence. Because in the end, wars aren't won by what stands the tallest, but by what keeps moving when everything else falls apart. If you made it this far, remember this: strength isn't perfection, it's persistence. What do you think truly wins in the end? Power or endurance? Tell me what you believe.